than a quarter of a century, I've carried the weight of my untold story, a secret that could have gone with me to the grave. However, as my days draw to a close, I find myself compelled to unburden my conscience before I meet my Maker. It's not much time that I have left in this world, you see. The consequences of my heavy smoking habits have finally caught up with me, and the cancer that has taken root in my lungs has spread beyond any hope of remedy. The doctors have given me no more than 6 months to live, so it's now or never for my last confession. In theory, the Historical Inquiries team may still pursue me for the crimes I'm about to admit in this account. However, the odds are that I'll be 6 feet under long before the case ever sees the inside of a courtroom. And so, here it is, my story, for better or worse. I came into this world in North Belfast during the tumultuous 1970s. Like many unfortunate souls of my generation, I was inexorably drawn into the whirlwind of violence that swept through the streets of my hometown, as Northern Ireland was plunged into the bloody chaos of the Troubles. I was raised on the Protestant side of the divide, my father a former soldier, and my mother a devoted housewife and follower of the infamous Reverend Ian Paisley. My allegiance was never in question. I considered myself an Ulsterman, a staunch defender of my British identity, and I was resolved to fight for the future of my people. My journey down this dark path began in my early teens when I started skipping school to engage in clashes and brawls with Catholic youths from across the divide. As I grew older, the violence escalated, and I found myself inexorably drawn into the world of Loyalist paramilitaries, a group of local toughs who believed that the police and army were not doing enough, and that it was our duty to take the law into our own hands, waging war against the IRA and their supporters within the Catholic community. At least that's what I convinced myself of in the beginning. Now, with the clarity of hindsight, I see that I was an unwitting cog in a ruthless, sectarian killing machine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My story commences during the scorching summer of 1998, shortly after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. On paper, our country was now on the path to peace. However, in reality, violence persisted as Loyalists clashed with security forces over the Drumcree March, and Republican dissidents unleashed horror with the Omagh bombing. At the time, I resided in what Belfast referred to as an interface area. This meant that our residents straddled the demarcation between a Protestant and a Catholic neighborhood, divided by what was known as a peace wall, a physical barrier constructed from brick and steel, intended to keep the two communities separated and diminish the likelihood of violent incidents. My house directly faced this wall, situated just across the street from where I lived. At the end of our street, adjacent to the terminus of the wall, stood a roundabout and a small row of shops shared by both communities. Over the years, this flashpoint witnessed numerous riots and, sadly, several homicides. As for myself, I had recently completed a 4-year prison sentence for involvement with a paramilitary group, and I had made a promise to my wife that I would steer clear of trouble and concentrate on caring for our young family. Regrettably, this was a commitment I failed to uphold. Amid the intense rioting that summer, some of our neighbors chose to flee the area, but those of us who remained adopted a standard defensive arrangement within our homes. The head of the household, typically the father or man, would sleep on the ground floor, often keeping a hatchet or baseball bat close at hand for protection. Meanwhile, the wife and children would sleep toward the back of the house, near an escape route in case of a nighttime assault. Windows were either reinforced or shielded with steel cages to guard against petrol bomb attacks. As an additional precaution, we kept the bathtub filled with cold water and a bucket nearby, ready to douse any fires that might erupt. Needless to say, this was far from an ideal environment for raising a family. My wife couldn't bear to remain in such circumstances and left with our children to stay with her parents. I'll never forget the day they departed, as she vented her anger while our son and daughter sobbed beside her. 4 years, 4 long years I waited for you, the trials I endured, the shame of my husband being in prison. You assured me this was all behind us. You promised to distance yourself from those individuals and take care of our family. What is wrong with you? Do you care more about a flag, about your cause? What about our children? What about me? I remained silent throughout her impassioned outburst. What could I say? I didn't want to lose my family, but I knew they would be safer away from that place. And why didn't I go with them, you might wonder? Well, I don't have a truly satisfactory answer. At the time, I was committed to staying and defending our home. I once believed that my children would one day express gratitude once they realized I had taken a stand to safeguard their future. However, I now understand that it was my own pride that tethered me to that place, and it's a choice I'll carry with me as a regret until my final breath. In some ways, the riots of '98 bore a resemblance to the numerous clashes we had witnessed in the past. Young individuals from opposing sides clashed in hand-to-hand combat, or hurled makeshift missiles at each other, such as half-bricks. On occasion, paramilitary gunmen from either side would emerge, showering the riot zone with bullets. Eventually, the security forces would arrive in full force, rolling into the area with armored vehicles and APCs, attempting to disperse the rioters with plastic bullets. Predictably, both sides would target these armored vehicles with rocks and petrol bombs, and the all-too-familiar cycle of violence would unfold. Regrettably, this was the norm during those times. However, the summer of rioting that year felt different. Those of us who lived in the area sensed that something was profoundly amiss, although few were willing to openly acknowledge it. Rumors whispered in the back corners of pubs and underground drinking establishments were the only hints of a deeper truth. Nobody wanted to confront the reality, but we all felt the creeping darkness that had descended upon our long-suffering community during those chaotic days. Late at night, after the rioters had dispersed and the armored vehicles had retreated from the streets, that's when we heard it. The night was shattered by a hellish, inhuman wail, piercingly loud and high-pitched. I vividly remember lying on my front room sofa, clutching my hatchet tightly as that dreadful scream assaulted my ears. The chilling, gut-wrenching sound sent shivers down to my very core, awakening a primal fear within me. What was worse, I had heard that wail before, and I knew what it signified. My tale unfolds over 3 consecutive nights in July 1998, coinciding with the 12th, a day of Protestant celebration commemorating William of Orange's victory over the Catholic James II in the late 17th century. However, that year left little room for celebration as both communities grappled with the repercussions of our bitter conflict. A harsh lesson delivered by a supernatural entity hailing from realms beyond our mortal understanding. On the afternoon of the 10th, I seized a moment of tranquility to stroll up to the stores and purchase a pack of cigarettes. The encounter that followed, however, proved far from pleasant. The young shop assistant manning the till, whom I recognized as hailing from the Catholic side of the divide, reciprocated my recognition with a hateful glare. She wordlessly completed the transaction, aggressively tossing my change onto the counter. I shot her a defiant look, briefly considering a verbal retort, but ultimately decided against it. I was well aware that even a minor altercation within the store had the potential to ignite a full-blown riot. Instead, I silently collected my coins and exited the shop, my anger simmering as I unexpectedly crossed paths with a former fellow soldier. Striding confidently down the sidewalk toward me, he sported a black bomber jacket, jeans, and a baseball cap concealing his bald head. A vacuous grin adorned his face as he extended his hand, greeting me with enthusiasm. "How's it going, big man?" he exclaimed. I reluctantly shook his hand, a sense of degradation creeping over me. "All right, Victor, how are you?" I replied with limited enthusiasm. "Everything's fine, mate. Busy. Those folks over there are keeping us on our toes." He gestured toward the wall, making it clear who he meant. I nodded in agreement, avoiding his cold gaze. "Yes, it's been tense lately. Likely to get worse in the coming days." "Damn right," Victor responded with a malicious smirk. "But we'll give them a taste of their own medicine. Mark my words, mate." He pointed upward at the weathered Union Jack hanging from a lamppost above us, flapping gently in the breeze. "We'll ensure our flag continues to fly over this district, no doubt about it." He paused, looking at me coldly before adding, "Pity you don't have the guts to stand with us." His comment struck a nerve, and my initial impulse was to strike Victor's smug face. However, I knew such an action would land me in considerable trouble, so I suppressed the urge. Victor held the position of officer commanding in the local Loyalist paramilitary unit operating in this area. Ostensibly responsible for the district's defense, in reality, He and his men spent most of their time peddling drugs and extorting protection money from local businesses for personal gain. However, Victor had undergone a significant transformation in my absence, emerging as a formidable figure. As a result, I found it necessary to extend him a certain degree of deference. Swallowing my pride and suppressing my anger, I replied, "Yes, Victor, I'll contribute when the time comes, but I've distanced myself from the organization now. My service is behind me." Victor's smug expression widened as he casually acknowledged, "You've certainly fulfilled your obligations. Remind me, how many years were you sentenced to?" Although he was well aware of the answer, I gritted my teeth and shared. 7 years were handed down to me. I served 4. It was due to illegal firearm possession and affiliation with a banned group. With a piercing gaze, Victor delivered his next words. "Indeed, they got you on those charges, but not the major one, correct?" A surge of painful memories rushed back, leaving me feeling as though I'd been struck in the gut. Struggling to speak, I finally responded, my lips trembling, "No, I was never convicted for that." Victor's sadistic grin persisted. "You and I share a long history, son. Keep that in mind before you adopt a holier-than-thou attitude." With that, he slapped me on the back and continued down the road, shouting back over his shoulder, "Goodbye, mate. See you tomorrow night." And just like that, he disappeared, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I had no desire to sit in an empty house and dwell on the past, so I decided to visit the nearby social club for some company and a couple of pints. I stood before the security gate in front of the heavily fortified establishment, pressed the button, and stared up at the camera until they granted me entry. Inside, the club's decor featured worn-out couches, stools, and peeling wallpaper from the 1970s. The walls proudly displayed symbols and images commemorating Ulster's imperial tradition, including photographs of uniformed men, banners from local Orange lodges, and plaques honoring our fallen comrades. Above the bar, a prominent Union Jack flag stood as a symbol of our enclave, defiantly positioned on the fringes of enemy territory. The club was sparsely populated, with only a handful of regulars at the bar and a few others occupying corner booths. I approached the bar and greeted Johnny, the club manager, ordering a pint of lager and paying with the change in my pocket. Acknowledging the bartender with a nod, I leisurely made my way to one of the adjacent tables where 2 of my neighbors sat, nursing their drinks. The gentleman gently sipping his pint bore the name Chris. In his 30s, he embodied the essence of a friendly, well-liked family man who made a living as a taxi driver. A warm smile greeted me as I approached, followed by a hearty handshake and an offered seat. Chris was one of those amiable individuals who effortlessly connected with everyone around him. Politics and religion were topics he wisely avoided, allowing him to traverse the city's divided landscape, ferrying passengers from both communities. Nevertheless, Chris remained somewhat naive about the perils of navigating the troubled streets of North Belfast late at night. I had cautioned him on numerous occasions, but he always dismissed my concerns with a laugh and the words, "Why would anyone want to shoot me?" Seated beside the carefree Chris was a somber widow named Mary, a woman in her late 40s whose husband had perished in a bombing 2 decades prior. Her loss had been an unbearable tragedy from which she had never fully recovered. Her life had become a relentless cycle of grief and bitterness, perpetuated by the ongoing conflict that had claimed her husband. She offered me a curt nod as I settled in, taking a sip of white wine before lighting a cigarette. "Well," I began, placing my pint glass on the worn wooden table, "I must say, seeing the 2 of you drinking together is quite the surprise. Is this a display of Protestant solidarity?" Mary scoffed with disdain, while Chris erupted into hearty laughter at my jest, underscoring the stark contrast between their personalities. "You'll never believe what Mary's been sharing with me, mate," Chris exclaimed, his excitement evident. "You've got to hear this." Mary shot him a venomous glare, and for a moment I feared she might splash her drink in Chris's face. "So what's the scoop, Mary?" I inquired, half in jest. She drew deeply from her cigarette before responding. "You men find amusement in mocking me, but I see through your bravado. We've all heard it. The eerie wailing in the dead of night. It's not normal." "Ah, that's just some kids fooling around," I retorted, attempting to sound confident, though the talk of nocturnal screams sent shivers down my spine. Mary vigorously shook her head. "You couldn't be more wrong. The entity out there isn't human anymore, not by any stretch. The tales speak of her as a young woman once dwelling in this very city. But tragedy befell her, and she became possessed by a malevolent spirit from the other side. And now, she prowls through the streets and villages of this country, driven by a thirst for vengeance against those who wronged her in life, she declared. Pausing for a moment, she fixed me with an intense, fiery gaze. You comprehend, don't you? Deep within you acknowledge the truth. That entity out there is the banshee, the harbinger of death. She will not depart from this place until she claims a soul. As soon as her words subsided, Chris and I exchanged glances across the table and erupted into fits of uncontrollable laughter. The banshee, I exclaimed, tears of amusement streaming down my cheeks. The harbinger of death. What an absurd notion. Our laughter continued as Mary abruptly stood up, snatched her glass, and stormed away from our table in a fury. She yelled over her shoulder, "You'll see! You foolish men will learn the hard way. Evil is descending upon our street. Mark my words." Once she had retreated out of earshot, I leaned in and whispered to Chris, "She's completely out of touch with reality. Her mind hasn't been right for years." "Yeah," Chris replied with a hint of sympathy as the smile faded from her face. "It's rather sad. I suppose I feel sorry for her." I nodded in agreement, finishing my pint. "Want another one?" One pint led to another, and soon enough we were on to our third, fourth, and fifth. Inebriated, we stumbled out of the door, exchanging friendly pats on each other's backs as we bid farewell. The night had fallen, and the street appeared deserted, or so we thought. As I ventured down the road, keeping a watchful eye on the remains of the peace wall, I half expected trouble to erupt at any moment. Yet my shock was unparalleled when I spotted a dark silhouette blocking my path home. Most of the streetlights lay shattered from recent riots, casting an eerie darkness over the road. Though I couldn't discern the stranger's features, I somehow sensed their piercing gaze fixed directly upon me. I faced my fair share of perilous situations, and fear seldom grips me, but at that moment I was overcome by a primal terror that sent shivers down my spine, leaving me rooted to the spot. I've faced my fair share of perilous situations, and fear seldom grips me, but at that moment I was overcome by a primal terror that sent shivers down my spine, leaving me rooted to the spot. Suddenly, a cacophony of shouts erupted from behind me, accompanied by the shattering of glass. I jerked my head around to witness a gang of unruly youths hurling bottles and spewing obscenities as they initiated their nightly ritual of chaos. My gaze lingered on the young rioters for a mere moment before redirecting my attention to the path ahead. Astonishingly, when I did, the enigmatic stranger had vanished into thin air, leaving the thoroughfare eerily desolate. Despite this surreal disappearance, a lingering unease gripped me as I briskly retraced my steps toward my residence, vigilantly scanning my surroundings, half expecting an ambush from an unseen assailant. My trembling hands struggled to locate my keys and clumsily insert them into the lock. Finally, I stumbled inside, forcefully slamming the door shut behind me. The overwhelming relief of being safely indoors washed over me, though not without a hint of self-reproach for my paranoia. In my already inebriated state from a night of revelry at the club, my frayed nerves compelled me to reach for a bottle of whiskey in an ill-conceived attempt to lull myself into slumber. Slowly, I succumbed to the embrace of dreams. In the realms of sleep, I found myself thrust back in time, reacquainting myself with a place I had fervently hoped never to revisit. I occupied the passenger seat of a stolen Ford Cortina, gloved hands fidgeting nervously with a weighty .357 Magnum revolver. My gaze flicked to my companion in the driver's seat, Victor. The youthful paramilitary exuded an air of bravado, yet the telltale tapping of his fingers on his knee and the steady stream of cigarette smoke betrayed his inner apprehension. We both maintained vigilant watch over the dimly lit street, impatiently awaiting our target while the specter of discovery loomed large. We found ourselves deep within enemy territory, a working-class Catholic neighborhood notorious as an IRA stronghold. Our objective: eliminate a prominent Republican activist residing on this very street. Our orders were unequivocal, and we understood the dire consequences of failure. Victor and I were but youngsters, barely beyond our teenage years, thrust into this baptism of active service by our commanding officer. We were acutely aware that any misstep could prove catastrophic. Yet, our quarry remained conspicuously tardy. The intelligence had assured us of his return from work hours ago, yet we continued to wait, anxiety mounting with each passing moment. In our stolen vehicle, clad in balaclavas and armed with a loaded firearm, we teetered on the precipice of calamity. If apprehended by the RUC or Army, a lengthy prison sentence awaited us. Even more harrowing was the prospect of encountering the IRA on their turf, a perilous outcome that could well lead us to an early grave. Victor stubbed out his cigarette on the dashboard after taking a final drag. "Damn it! Where the hell is that guy?" he muttered angrily. I didn't respond. Instead, I shook my head in frustration. Victor clicked his tongue disapprovingly before continuing. "If he doesn't show up soon, we might have to call off the mission." I shot him an incensed glare and retorted, "Seriously, Victor? You want to go back and report our failure to the boss?" Avoiding eye contact, Victor turned away, well aware that I was speaking the truth. Failure wasn't an option, and we couldn't return empty-handed until we had taken a life. Suddenly, there was movement on the dimly lit street as a figure leisurely strolled down the sidewalk across from us. I spotted a middle-aged man with a round belly and a bald head, dressed in a tweed suit and trench coat. Adrenaline coursed through me as I leaned forward in my car seat, trying to get a better look at him under the streetlights. Victor also noticed him and asked, "Is that our guy?" "I'm not certain," I replied anxiously. We had seen photographs from stolen intelligence files, but identifying the man in the darkness was challenging. "I'm not sure if it's him, mate," Victor admitted solemnly. Something snapped within me at that moment. My heart filled with rage, and my mind was flooded with images of Union Jacks draped over coffins and bombed buildings with terrified civilians fleeing. I craved vengeance for the atrocities I had witnessed and the continuous attacks on our people. And in that moment, I didn't care who paid the price. "To hell with it," I spat out with venom. "He'll do." With that declaration, I swung open the car door, pulled my balaclava over my face, gripped my revolver tightly, and stormed down the street toward my intended target. He didn't see me coming, at least not initially. I was almost upon him before our eyes locked in the dim light. Initially, confusion registered on his face, but it swiftly transformed into fear when he spotted the gun in my hand. My intended victim stood frozen in terror, unable to move as he stared down the barrel of my firearm. My finger hovered over the trigger, but I couldn't bring myself to pull it. In that moment, self-doubt overcame me, and I just stood there, my hand trembling as I gazed into the man's pleading eyes. I couldn't discern how much time passed as we confronted each other on the darkened pavement. It might have been only seconds, but it felt like hours. However, the tense standoff reached an abrupt conclusion when the night air was suddenly pierced by a blood-curdling scream, a nightmarish, almost otherworldly howl that nearly deafened me. My target's eyes widened, and he made a desperate attempt to flee. My instincts took over and I pulled the trigger. The gunshot reverberated through my hand as the bullet tore into the man's chest, sending his body sprawling backward, his mouth open in a soundless scream. Meanwhile, the disembodied shrieking persisted, growing louder and more piercing, assaulting my ears to the point where it felt like my head might explode. My victim now writhed in agony on the pavement, clawing at the gaping, bloody wound in his chest. I took aim and fired again and again. Each shot was a dum-dum bullet, tearing open the unfortunate man's chest, exposing a gruesome spectacle of flesh and bone. I continued firing until I heard the empty click, signaling that I had exhausted all 6 rounds in the chamber. The lifeless body of my victim lay sprawled on the blood-soaked ground, his vacant eyes fixed on the night sky above. Suddenly, the relentless screaming ceased, and I found myself standing alone in the street, looming over the lifeless man I had brutally dispatched. My attention was then drawn to a window across the street. A curtain twitched, and a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, appeared at the window, her eyes filled with horror as she bore witness to the gruesome scene, her innocence forever shattered. "Come on, hurry up!" Victor's urgent cry snapped me back to reality. I spun around to see Victor shouting from the open window of the stolen car. His words jolted me into action as I fled the scene, leaping into the passenger seat of the Cortina and slamming the door shut. In an instant, Victor slammed his foot on the accelerator, and we sped down the street, making our successful escape. Half an hour later, we stood atop Cave Hill, gazing down at the city lights below as the stolen car burned behind us. Another vehicle, driven by one of our comrades, had arrived to transport us to a nearby safe house. There, we would dispose of our incriminating clothing, eliminate any forensic evidence from the murder weapon, and return it to a concealed arms cache. I had managed to evade the consequences of murder, but I knew I could never escape the guilt and horror of what I had done. In that moment, I looked up at the night sky and wished for a divine bolt of lightning to strike me down. But naturally, I wouldn't escape so easily from my past. Abruptly, I snapped awake, leaping from the sofa, drenched in cold sweat and gasping for air. Once again, I had been thrust back into that haunting night from years past, trapped within the vivid clutches of a nightmare. Now, fully conscious, normalcy should have returned, but an unsettling sensation lingered. An eerie feeling of being under surveillance clawed at me, and my eyes darted frantically through the dim room. My gaze fixated on the drawn curtains, casting a dark silhouette of a figure lurking just beyond my living room window. My eyes widened, and my entire body quivered as I cautiously approached the window. With a trembling hand, I hesitantly pulled back the curtains. What met my gaze on the other side was a living nightmare personified, the visage of a once human woman now transformed into a grotesque entity. I observed the creature's unkempt jet-black hair, ghostly pallor strangely illuminated by an unnatural glow, and abyssal, soulless eyes akin to those of a shark. I remained frozen, paralyzed by terror, questioning if I were still ensnared in a dream. Then she parted her vile lips, unveiling a pitch-black gaping void. The sound that emanated from it was chillingly familiar. The banshee's lament, an otherworldly, ear-piercing shriek that sent me recoiling from the window. I clutched my ears, curling into a ball, silently pleading for the tormenting cacophony to cease. The agony in my head was excruciating, threatening to render me unconscious. But mercifully, the nightmarish sound abruptly ceased. My ears still rang as I unsteadily rose to my feet, seizing a hatchet concealed behind the sofa, and impulsively charged toward the front door, a foolish surge of bravado propelling me. Moments later, I found myself on the deserted street, the creature having vanished without a trace. I stood there, awestruck, gazing up at the starlit sky, my body trembling, tears streaming down my face. The following night arrived, and I reluctantly made my way to the 11th night bonfire, standing amidst a desolate wasteland. I watched as a towering pyre, constructed from wooden pallets and discarded tires, was set ablaze. This annual tradition marked the prelude to the marches and bands scheduled for the next day in the Loyalist districts of Belfast. Truth be told, I had no desire to be there. After the unsettling events of the previous evening, I had little inclination for celebration. Still, the thought of another lonely night at home, coupled with the lingering fear of encountering that dreadful entity, compelled me to attend the gathering. Normally, this event exuded an air of festivity, but this year was different. Despite a handful of locals engaged in casual conversations while sipping their beers, an undeniable tension hung in the air. Recent days of violence had put everyone on edge, but this unease was just one layer of the unsettling atmosphere. I suspected that every resident in the estate had heard the terrifying wails of the banshee in the dead of night, and perhaps, like me, others had experienced encounters with the malevolent demon. It all felt surreal, and a part of me questioned my sanity. However, I couldn't shake the memory of Mary's chilling prophecy, which left me wondering if she alone held the key to the truth. As I absent-mindedly sipped a lukewarm beer and gazed into the flames, seeking solace in their warmth, a commotion erupted behind me. A voice called out, "Victor, what about you, son?" Turning, I observed the arrival of my old comrade, Victor, who was met with a mix of fear and reverence from the locals. But something was amiss. The Victor I knew, with his usual charm and swagger, had vanished. His eyes lacked any hint of emotion, and his pallid complexion contrasted starkly with his usual vitality. He advanced with a cold determination, ignoring those who attempted to engage him, fixating on the blazing fire before him. My astonishment grew as he marched right past me without a glance and walked directly into the heart of the flames. "Victor, what in the world?" I screamed, but it was too late. The fire consumed his clothes and soon began to scorch his skin and flesh, emitting a horrifying scent reminiscent of a human barbecue. In an instant, Victor snapped back to reality, shrieking in agony as he stumbled out of the flames. By then, his entire body was ablaze. Without hesitation, I and several of Victor's comrades sprang into action, pushing him to the grass and rolling his burning form to extinguish the flames. We succeeded, but not before Victor had suffered severe burns. His clothes melded to his scorched skin as he continued to scream uncontrollably. "Someone call an ambulance, for God's sake," I yelled, desperately trying to provide some comfort to my old friend. About 10 minutes later, I found myself standing there, a helpless spectator, as they carefully loaded the badly injured Victor onto a gurney and gingerly slid him into the waiting ambulance. The shock and revulsion welled up inside me, a whirlwind of emotions swirling within, all while the enigma of his actions eluded my comprehension. As I grappled with this unsettling scene, Mary, with an air of sternness bordering on smugness, sidled up beside me. She alone seemed to possess an explanation for Victor's inexplicable act. Her voice carried a weight of grim knowledge as she shared her revelation. "She came for Victor," Mary began, her words sending a shiver down my spine. She unveiled the profound darkness buried deep within his soul. Clearly it was a burden too immense for him to bear, leading him to attempt to offer himself to the consuming flames. "You've saved him this night, but mark my words, it shall make no difference in the end. The banshee shall remain with us until she claims her intended victim, and if Victor survives, another soul shall surely bear the burden." An indignant glare welled up within me, a desire to challenge Mary's ominous prophecy, yet I found myself utterly powerless to do so. Just a mere 24 hours prior, I had laughed at Mary's tales of the supernatural, but the chilling reality before me silenced my skepticism. Having conveyed her unsettling message, she departed, leaving me to watch in silence as the ambulance doors sealed Victor's fate, carrying him away to the hospital. Soon the dawn of the 12th day arrived, and I positioned myself at the far end of the street, opposite the shops, anticipating the appearance of the marching bands. The sky above was cloaked in somber gray, and a relentless drizzle soaked the few spectators who had braved the inclement weather. The atmosphere was far from festive. It resembled a funeral procession more than a community celebration. The turnout was sparse, even the nationalist counter-protesters having opted to remain absent, choosing to ignore the event entirely. It occurred to me that the malevolent force stalking our streets seemed to target both communities indiscriminately, sowing terror and fear in its wake. I observed the bedraggled band members slowly marching down the road, their orange sashes and black suits drenched by the ceaseless rain. Their solemn procession was accompanied by the mournful beat of a single lambeg drum, a cadence that mirrored a grim march toward death, an eerie coincidence given the circumstances. The soaked Orangemen trudged forward, heads bowed, as if they considered this event more a burden than an honor. The meager gathering of onlookers mirrored this dispassion, and it was evident that we all yearned for the event to conclude. This was meant to be the pinnacle of the Protestant calendar, a celebration of our historical triumphs, and an affirmation of our ongoing struggle to preserve our identity. On that fateful night, an ominous darkness loomed over our tight-knit community, casting an eerie premonition of impending tragedy. After the march, I rushed home, heedless of my rain-soaked attire, settling into my front room with a sense of foreboding. I resorted to chain-smoking in a futile attempt to quell my frayed nerves. Although the specifics remained elusive, an undeniable sense of doom gripped us all. It was as though my past transgressions had finally caught up with me, and the banshee herself had arrived to mete out my long-awaited punishment. Inescapably, I believed she was coming for me next. Yet I could never have foreseen the gruesome calamity that awaited us. As dusk settled, a haunting and dreadfully familiar wail pierced the air, announcing the banshee's presence. My heart raced, prompting me to spring up from the sofa, forsaking my hatchet, for I knew it would be futile. Anticipating an imminent assault on my home, I soon realized the unearthly shriek emanated from outside, farther down the street. The banshee's mournful cry persisted for agonizing minutes before abruptly ceasing. Moments later, the ominous staccato of automatic gunfire shattered the eerie calm, signaling the malevolent intent of a paramilitary assailant. Without hesitation, I rushed out of my front door and onto the dimly lit street. Turning my gaze toward the nearby roundabout, I witnessed a taxi stranded in the middle of the road, its windshield ravaged by bullets, the acrid scent of cordite lingering in the air. And there she stood, the banshee, an ethereal figure radiating in the darkness, her jet-black eyes devoid of empathy or humanity, silently locking onto me. In that prolonged moment of confrontation, she exuded disdain, making me feel as though my soul was unworthy of her claim. I watched in mesmerized horror as the banshee glided down the street, her luminous presence gradually fading until she inexplicably dissolved into the obscurity of the night. Driven by fear, I ventured forward after her departure, dreading the grim reality that awaited at the bullet-riddled taxi. Others from the community had also converged on the scene, forming an impromptu gathering in the face of tragedy. Mary, too, was among them, her once smug countenance replaced by one of sorrow and grief. I arrived first at the taxi and was met with a sight that confirmed my worst fears had come to pass. My friend Chris lay slumped over the steering wheel, his body pierced by a hail of bullets, and his blood seeping into the driver's seat's fabric. Chris remained motionless, his life extinguished. A surge of fury welled up within me as my exhausted mind grappled with the senselessness of this brutality. Why Chris? Why would anyone murder an innocent family man who had never harmed a soul? Why did fate decree that a virtuous man should perish while someone like me, a remorseless killer, escaped unscathed? It was an injustice, but in this wretched, honorless conflict, injustice was the norm. Nothing could be done. The banshee had claimed Chris's soul, aided by an unidentified paramilitary assailant, who might have belonged to either side. Now the beleaguered community was left to piece together the remnants of their shattered lives. This is my story, a sordid chronicle of the violent summer of '98, when the banshee descended upon our street, casting an enduring shadow over my life. Over the past 25 years, I've endured a wretched existence. My family never returned, and I succumbed to loneliness, depression, and alcoholism, ultimately succumbing to ill health. As I lie in this hospital bed, writing my final confession, I realize that I have only a few months left to live. Cancer gnaws away at me from within, bringing me closer to the inevitable. During the night, as I rest in my dimly lit room, I can hear her, the banshee's mournful wail echoing through the walls. She never truly abandoned me, haunting me all these years as I spiraled into self-destructive habits. The banshee may not have claimed my soul in that fateful summer of '98, but she is patient, and deep down I always knew she would catch up to me in the end. I've come to accept my fate, longing for the sweet release of death, regardless of what lies beyond. As for the banshee, I've learned more about her story in recent years, and I can't help but feel compassion for the girl she once was. I am not her first victim, but I pray that I will be the last. Sooner or later, this madness must come to an end,